Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this meetup, our 244th, sorry for the typo, 244th episode of the CF Meetup, being recorded on Thursday, February 18th, 2016 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we've got Dan Wilson and TJ VanToll who are going to be talking to us about NativeScript, an open source platform to build native iOS and Android apps. And so with that, let me turn things over to Dan, who will start things out. Welcome, Dan. Welcome, TJ. There, Dan, we don't hear you.
Welcome everybody. This is once again NativeScript, an open source platform to build native iOS and Android apps. A quick note, if you want to download this presentation and either follow along or possibly give this same presentation to your user group, there's a tiny URL at the bottom of this slide. You can download this copy. I'll also put this link at the end of the slide deck in case you're not fast enough writing it down. So, NativeScript. NativeScript is a runtime for building and running iOS and Android apps. The beautiful thing about it is you get to use the skills you already have as a web developer to build mobile apps. And whenever we talk about this, we naturally get a few questions to clarify what NativeScript is, so let's talk about what it isn't. Firstly, sorry folks, this is not PhoneGap and it's not Ionic. You get real, legitimate native components. These aren't DOM elements, and I'm personally grateful for that. Firstly, the DOM is a great document layout language. It is absolutely horrible for applications. Clearing floats, anyone? So with NativeScript, you don't get HTML elements that pretend to be native components. You get actual native components. And this is of course better because HTML elements are not designed with the same performance that native components are. Plus, the look and feel is more natural to users who are using other native applications. It's also not Xamarin. Xamarin is a language to cross-compile from .NET into native iOS and native Android and also native Windows for Windows Ultimate. What's great about that is you can cross-compile and share code. What's bad about it is you have to write .NET. Unless you're a .NET developer, you probably don't really want to learn .NET just to get into mobile programming. Also, Xamarin asks you to write all these bindings to bind your code to native APIs. In NativeScript, you don't have to do that. You have direct access to the mobile platform APIs. It's also not React Native. React Native is the cool new hipster way to write mobile applications. It's great if you know Objective-C or Swift or Java because you will be binding with those languages. Unlike NativeScript, which has 100% direct access to the native APIs using JavaScript. So NativeScript, you might say, how much is it? Well, it's free, so you can take it right now. Well, I'll even sign your copy if you like. Just go ahead and print out the GitHub page, send it to me. I'll send it right back. It's open source on the Apache 2.0 license, so you can pretty much do whatever you want. We make no restrictions beyond just that license, and it's available on GitHub today. It's also supported by Telerik. Now you may say, who's Telerik? Well, if you've ever used Kendo UI or any of the other fantastic developer products, then you know Telerik. Why is this important, you might ask? I've built open source products. I've used open source products. Early in my career, I was totally fine downloading that weird date picker from some guy whose name I couldn't pronounce. But as I've gotten older, I realized that applications have a long lifespan. And the things you use to build your applications need to have a similarly long lifespan. And there are certain open source products and services that just disappear. Like, since I started this presentation, there have been at least 3 new super cool JavaScript frameworks that quote-unquote you should be using. Also, because your mobile platform is such a deep part of your strategy, it's important that this partner stay with you. For example, if you're familiar with what happened with Parse a few weeks ago, Parse was a mobile backend. It was great. It was bought by Facebook last year for $60 to $80 million, and a few weeks ago Facebook decided they're shutting it down. So if you've spent time and energy building your mobile strategy on parse, guess what? You're going to spend time and energy redoing it in something else. So having a partner like Telerik is super important because we're invested in your success. We build developer products and services, so we get it. This is how we make our money. We don't make our money when you click on one more funny cat ad on Facebook. So what do you get? Well, you get your choice in architecture. You can write your NativeScript applications in plain old modern JavaScript. This is my preferred way right now. I'm familiar with JavaScript. I can use JavaScript to interact with the mobile platform, create components and such, and it's pretty great. If you're coming from an object-oriented background, you might prefer TypeScript. You get some extra things with TypeScript, especially compile time, warnings about errors. You get a little bit stricter typing. You get some code reuse capabilities. So that's an option for those who prefer a more strongly typed architecture. And also we have an integration with Angular. It's currently in beta right now, like Angular 2 is, but you'll be able to write your mobile application using Angular 2. And this is cool because if your web strategy is Angular 2, you can use almost all of your code in your mobile strategy. So things you can consolidate on and use and only develop and test once. So NativeScript is cross-platform. You get iOS and Android today. Eventually we will support Windows Ultimate. It's something we're working on. If that's important for you, you might have to wait a minute. Windows Ultimate's not used a whole lot, so this probably isn't a big deal, but just know that it's coming. And you can see in the middle of the page there's some source code there. And it looks a lot like HTML, XML. This is your declarative layout. You can lay out your screens in your mobile with this XML format, and basically what it is it's a wrapper behind a whole lot of other JavaScript code. So you can see we have a page, there's a grid layout and some things in it, and that generates the layouts that you see on the right hand side. It's very easy to understand, and it's very easy to write mobile applications with. Speaking of easy to write applications, you can take advantage of lots of pre-built code. So there are thousands of plugins on NPM, node modules that you can use today. You can also use native controls from CocoaPods or Android Arsenal or a number of other sources in your applications today. So you can take advantage of a rich ecosystem, even native components, with still using just JavaScript. And I think that's actually pretty great. This is my favorite part about NativeScript. This is what hooked me. You actually get layouts. So unlike HTML where you say I'd like a 3-column layout and you get a kinda 3-column layout, unless something breaks your floats, in NativeScript a layout is a layout. It's very specific. There's a lot of useful ones you can use to make just that exact screen that you want, and it's very easy to do in the declarative markup. Angular 2. Pretty soon we'll be 100% Angular 2 compatible. We are waiting on Angular 2 to be 100% Angular 2 compatible. But when they are, you can write your NativeScript applications using Angular 2. And this to me is killer, because if you have a single page application strategy on Angular, you're not forced to learn some other paradigm. Stick with what you like, keep your skills in play, and build your mobile apps with Angular 2. There's a link down here below. You can learn a little bit more about our integration. And the killer feature of NativeScript is you have direct access to the native API. Now that may, if you're not coming from a mobile background, that may be a little bit strange. So let's look at a practical example. Take a minute and read over this code, and then ask yourself what it does. So in JavaScript, you can call a native platform API that is actually Java. Do stuff with it in JavaScript without having to go into Java. And why is this great? Well, I don't do Java. Android is Java, so how do you reconcile the two? But because of the way NativeScript is architected, you can use JavaScript to directly manipulate the native platform API. In this case, we've chosen a simple a time component, but you can access everything. Matter of fact, every single feature of the native platform is available the day it's introduced by the native platform vendor. And what this means is if Android comes up with thing B, you can use thing B. Other mobile platforms don't have this ability to have zero-day access. So this is one of the great things you get with NativeScript is you do not have to wait on us to implement something. When it's available, it's immediately available. Let's look at an iOS version. So take another minute and scan this code and see if you can guess what it does. Wash, rinse, repeat, right? We are using JavaScript to call native iOS components and then manipulating those with JavaScript. So we're not strongly typing things. We're not writing Objective-C. We're not writing Swift. We're staying in a language that we are comfortable with and still interacting very deeply with the native platform APIs. How deep? Well, you can go to the Apple docs and figure out how their native components work and use them. And you can see, thanks to our very classy red arrows here, this is where these properties came from. How's it work? Well, it's complicated. There's a lot of super duper really smart people that figured this out. The short version is there's a V8 JavaScript engine underneath the covers. We're talking about Android here. And under the covers, much like in ColdFusion, how you can write in a loosely typed language, but it actually compiles down to a strongly typed language, there's a proxy layer and an interpreted layer so that for every platform, you're actually calling the native API example. So here, when you say var file equals Java IO file path, you're not actually saying that. You're just basically in NativeScript creating a new file. So you ask yourself, great, I have access to the 100% native APIs, but I really don't want to do that. I can't blame you. It's kind of why it took me so long to get into mobile development. Like Objective-C just is a really difficult language for my brain to parse. There's these weird square bracketed commands in the middle of functions, and I just didn't get it. And I tried Java a long time ago, and I really did not like having to write 50 lines of code when I thought one would do. So what can you do here? In NativeScript, there's a capability called a module, and a module is a JavaScript wrapper around a specific piece of the platform API, and there's tons of these. So what this means is someone's already taken the work of wrapping up either an Android specific or an iOS specific or a platform implementation that'll work with both, and you can just call it in JavaScript, meaning you can stay in your layer and develop. You don't have to get down deep. You can. You have that power. You don't necessarily have to use it. So here's what it looks like in NativeScript. This first two lines of code is the NativeScript part. Firstly, you require the file system plugin, and then secondly, you call it. It's very simple. If you're on an Android platform or if the target runtime is Android, you can see the code below that fires. If you're on iOS, the bottom set of code fires. And as a developer, you don't have to care. We also use modern syntaxes like promises for anything that requires callbacks. You don't have to necessarily deal with callbacks. You can just use promises. This saves a ton of code and a whole lot of really weird scoping problems. So if you're familiar with this syntax, you will be right at home. Now, we have some live coding demonstrations. TJ is going to do those, but I wanted to put these links up in front of you. So our homepage is nativescript.org. Once again, open source product. You can have it for free. We're not going to ask you for your credit card, although if you do want to mail me a $100 bill, I would appreciate that. My kids do have to go to college. Follow us on Twitter at NativeScript. And also, we have a Slack channel we just opened up this week. So if you like using Slack, feel free to join us. The third link there is your Get an Invite link to our Slack channel, and come in and talk with us a little bit about NativeScript. And then the last link is the link for downloading this presentation. So I'm going to turn this over to TJ. Go ahead and take your print screens now. We'll put this deck back up at the end of the presentation. That way during Q&A, you can write anything down that you might have missed.
All right. Can everybody hear me all right? Just to make sanity check here while I'm sharing my screen. I got to get used to this software. All right, hopefully everybody can hear me. If not, someone will have to interrupt me. So what I wanted to do is just give everybody a sort of a kind of brief introduction to what it actually, what building a NativeScript app actually feels like. Just walk through the basics of building a little app from scratch, and then showing off a few more complex examples of what NativeScript makes possible. Now you're seeing my desktop here, at least hopefully, and I have my command line here. The primary way that you interact with NativeScript is through the command line. NativeScript itself is a command line interface. There's sort of some runtimes behind it, as we'll see. And I got some bubbles popping up here. Sorry, I got to get used to this software here. I think I'm good to go though, so I'll go ahead and continue. The NativeScript CLI is built and it runs on NPM. So you install it with npm install, you install it globally, -G for NativeScript. And once you have that command installed, you'll have two commands available. You'll have both NativeScript, which I can run here to just see a giant list of all the commands, all the things I can do with NativeScript. We also have a little shorthand TNS, which is just short for Telerik NativeScript and is great for lazy people like me that don't really like to type all that well. So TNS create is actually how you start up a new NativeScript project. It just sort of scaffolds up an app for you. I'm going to switch over, instead of running that, to a little app that I've just pre-scaffolded out with a few files to save us a little bit of time today, and that I also have open in my editor here. And I want to talk for a minute just about how NativeScript projects, how NativeScript apps are actually structured. Now at a top level, two of the things you might notice right away are this node modules folder and a package.json file. If you've done any Node.js development before, if you've worked with NPM on, say, a front-end project, these conventions will probably look fairly familiar to you. As Dan sort of mentioned, one of the things we really try to do with NativeScript is build on top of existing ecosystems or existing things that the JavaScript community and the greater web community would be familiar with, and even some of the native mobile communities as well, as you can see. And this use of node modules in package.json file is one of those things. So if you're familiar with this, again, the syntax will look familiar. If not, this package.json file basically contains some metadata about your app. So in NativeScript, we use it to store version numbers and things like that, as well as dependencies. And later on in this demo, I'll show how we can add a few dependencies to this NativeScript project, both from NPM and also some NativeScript plugins that really let you tie into some native functionality. The other two folders here are app and platforms. And let me zoom in a little bit more so you can see them. Now, the way NativeScript works is your development code lives within this app folder. And we'll go over these files here in a moment. So this is where you're going to spend almost all of your time when you're actually working on your app. The platforms folder contains your actual native application. Now remember, with NativeScript, we're not building web apps here. We're building truly native Android and iOS apps. So you'll find files like all your Gradle build files and all these things that you're probably more familiar with if you've ever built Android apps natively before. And you can find this sort of equivalent files here over in iOS land, like your Xcode project and all of these types of things. Now with NativeScript, you can absolutely interact with these files. I could open up this app in Xcode. I could do any of the Xcode things with this app. All those things are available with NativeScript. But for the most part, we try to abstract you away from that so that you don't even really have to act like this platform folder even exists. And you can see that I'm using Git for source control here, and I'm actually excluding platforms from source control directly. Basically, I'm treating the platforms, the actual native stuff, as generated code, and node modules as well. So basically, this app is where I'm spending all of my time. This is also the code that I'm sharing with my teammates, that I'm maintaining, that sort of thing. So within app, so if this stuff is all generated, as I said, app is where you're spending the vast majority of your time. And you'll notice that there's three different file types that you'll see here, the three basic file types that NativeScript uses: JavaScript files, XML files, and CSS files. Now each of these files serves a different purpose in NativeScript. JavaScript files are probably the easiest to explain. It's where your application logic goes. You write application logic in JavaScript. You can optionally use TypeScript in NativeScript as well. I'm just using a simple JavaScript project for simplicity today. XML files are where you define your application's user interface components. You can see I have an extremely basic XML file here that I'll talk about in just a second. And CSS files are where you style your applications. We use a subset CSS is part of NativeScript, and I'll also go into details in that in just a moment. But at a high level, just know that you're writing code in JavaScript, XML, and CSS. So I'll tackle each of these individually, starting with the XML file, because that's sort of the logical stopping point if I back all the way out here. This is NativeScript Hello World. This is obviously this doesn't do much, but this just gives you a basic idea of where you get going with NativeScript. Now, Dan in his slides talked a bit earlier about how what we do with NativeScript is we take these APIs. He showed it with module examples, but the same sort of thing applies to UI components. And we're basically abstracting Android and iOS code for you. So one of the reasons we use XML, because this is a common question we get, why do you use XML instead of something like HTML? And part of the answer to that is, so we don't use HTML because there is no DOM, so there's no such thing as like a div in NativeScript. And the other reason is that we have to derive or basically implement each of these individual UI components you see here with an actual native component. So for instance, when I type label here, I could actually go in, this is actually implemented in this TNS core modules NPM module. And you can see all the things that we abstract just by the sheer scale of the size of this folder here. And I can go down to where the label is implemented here. And we have specific Android and iOS labels. And then there's usually some sort of common interface that gives you this platform agnostic API you see here. But what I could do is I could dive in, for instance, to the Android implementation and see that when I type label in XML here, what NativeScript is actually doing under the hood is creating an Android.widget.text view. And on iOS, I could look at the same thing, and it ends up being a UI label iOS control. Now, what's kind of cool about this is if you think of building a native app in some sort of other architecture, usually the source code that you see for this is sort of hidden or unreadable or some binary code or something like that. But with NativeScript, this is actually somewhat approachable. You can actually debug through this code because it's just JavaScript code that's running on your device. So you get this nice, concise API, but the power of using native controls under the hood. And I think it's actually easiest to see this in action. So I want to show you basically how you turn this tiny bit of XML into an actual application. And for that, I'm going to go back to my CLI here. And what I want to do is run this app. So there is a command tns run iOS. I'm going to pass the -- emulator flag, which will launch this app up in the iOS simulator. Now, what the CLI is actually doing here is, as I mentioned before, remember, these are truly native apps. So this is actually building an iOS app on the command line here, and it's going to launch and deploy this on the iOS simulator. Now, because of this, there are system requirements for the NativeScript CLI to make this happen. For instance, I have to have Xcode installed on my development machine. I have to have the iOS simulator available, for instance. And if you go to our docs, so this is docs.nativescript.org here, you'll see this installation link here. And then we have separate guides for Windows, OS X, and Linux. We support all three of these platforms, but because we're building the apps locally, the only way you can build iOS apps is to be on OS X. And the reason for that is Xcode only runs on OS X. And so I am on a Mac here, so I am able to build iOS apps. You can build Android apps on OS X as well. And on Windows and Linux, you can build Android apps. So move that over here. Move my simulator back into the window. It seems like the scale got screwed up here. Let's make this big. Yeah, there we go. So you can see, of course, this is absolutely enthralling, gorgeous app that I built here for Hello World. But you can see the process of how this works. This is, although it's not obvious with this simple example, we'll see it more in a minute here. This is a UI label. This is a native control. So there is no browser here, for instance. So I did that. And actually earlier, to save us some time, built this thing for Android as well, just so you could see the difference of what these looks like. Now, you might have noticed when I did that build, that took about 30 seconds. I might have a timer there in the CLI. So it takes a little bit of time because it's actually building a truly native app there. However, one of the cool things about NativeScript's architecture, where this sort of platforms here, to go back top level, platforms is separated from the app, is that once this app actually gets built, once you have this app running on the device, All the other code here, like these JavaScript, XML, CSS files, they're interpreted at runtime because of some of the architecture that Dan showed earlier today. And because they're interpreted at runtime, when I actually want to update this app, I can do it on the fly. So I'm going to bring my CLI over again, and we have this command known as live sync. I'm going to do this on Android that you can run, and I'll go ahead and start this up here. And if you add the -- watch flag, essentially live sync says just basically patch this app on the fly, more or less take any of my files, my logic that changed here, and just go ahead and patch it, basically live patch the device here. And the -- watch flag will additionally say also just watch these files. They're chilling here in my app directory. And whenever I change one of them, just go ahead and push that change out to the actual app. And as you can see, it's pretty fast and pretty simple to use. Now, I think this is especially powerful when you think about the equivalent. Remember that this is a native Android app. This is something that normally if you wanted to change an Android.widget.text view, you'd have to go through a Java build process, something like Gradle to actually see the change for. But because you're using this approach where this code is interpreted at runtime, it becomes really trivial to sort of make changes to your app and see them loaded on the fly. Now, of course, we are still dealing with what is essentially hello world at this point, so probably not all that impressive at this point. So let's ramp up the complexity level just a little bit, and I'm going to paste in 2 changes here. I'm going to change my XML file. I'm actually going to change the JavaScript file here as well, and then I'll sort of back up and explain what all of this is doing. So you can see this little list view here, get an idea of what this looks like, and then I'm going to take a few minutes here to just walk you through the code, just to give you a sense of what normal NativeScript development actually looks like. So I talked about XML earlier and how this contains UI components, and what I did here was just replace that label with a list view control, which is another common control that you see in mobile apps. Any app that tends to have like a feed, like your Facebook, Twitter type app, tends to use a list view. And within the list view, since it's designed to sort of work on an array of data, or each individual item in the array, we provide this item template, which basically just tells NativeScript for each item in the list view or for each item in the array, how should it actually be laid out. So this is just a label control that spits out some text. But what I actually mostly want to draw your attention to right now are the 2 new pieces of syntax that we've introduced here. The first is these attributes, this loaded attribute here, and the second is this double curly brace syntax that you see on line 2 here. Now, if we start at the top here, loaded equals loaded is actually bridging this XML file where my UI is defined here to the JavaScript file that makes up the logic of my app. You may have also noticed that these 2 files are named the same thing, main.xml and main.javascript. And when you use that approach, NativeScript essentially knows to sort of view these files as a unit, that this is the page's logic, this is the page's UI components or UI declaration. And you can also do the same thing with CSS files. You can write CSS that applies to just one page as well, using the same sort of naming approach. The other thing to note is this use of this exports keyword and also the require keyword here as well. So back to the sort of original messaging where we talked about how NativeScript builds upon sort of existing known sort of techniques and such. This is another thing that comes from Node. This is known as CommonJS, the CommonJS spec, if you haven't seen this before. If you have this, this will feel very much like you're working in a Node app or a browser app with something like Browserify. But if not, the syntax is pretty straightforward. Require is just how you bring in another JavaScript module. So I'm just saying I need to grab the JavaScript module that lives in this file. And exports is how you export something from your file for use in another file. So it's basically like exposing your module's public API. And so by tying this, because these 2 files are locked by NativeScript, anything I export from my JavaScript file is made available for my XML file to subscribe to. So in this case, I'm saying export this loaded function, and the XML is subscribing to that and saying, oh, there is a loaded event that NativeScript fires. And when this page loads, just run this logic. Now, so that's this syntax here, sort of the binding of events between XML and JavaScript. The other, as I said earlier, is this double curly brace syntax. Now, this may look familiar to you if you've done any sort of data binding for the web before, so something like Angular, React, that sort of thing. What we're doing here is we actually use a library that the folks at Google, the Polymer team, puts out for their data binding approach. We're just building on top of that since it's all just JavaScript. And basically, we're just saying this is just a way that you bind data in a JavaScript object to a user interface control. So in this case, the list view. Now, a list view operates on an array of data, and you can see that that actually corresponds to this array that you see here. The one other thing I should point out is the way that you sort of set this up behind the scenes here is we expose this binding context property, and really it's sort of a advanced sounding name, but it's just an object on which this double curly brace syntax operates. And you can see that the object that I assigned to the binding context, the property set on that matches up with what you see here. And that's what makes the bridge between JavaScript code for your data and what you actually subscribe to here in the XML. Which leaves the final thing, and what actually creates this data here, is now that this array is bound to this interface, all you got to do is fill it up with data, which is happening at the bottom here in this load items function. Now, again, I probably sound like a broken record here, but we're again trying to build on sort of existing APIs, existing solutions that are out there. And if you've done, if you're a web developer, you may be familiar with this method. It's the fetch method. This is actually something that Chrome recently implemented. It's intended to be sort of a successor to XML HTTP request. And Chrome has it. I think Firefox may have it now as well. If not, I know that they have it in the works. But basically, the browser uses the fetch method to allow you to perform HTTP requests, AJAX requests. And in NativeScript, what we do is we implement fetch with iOS and Android code. So the API here is exactly the same. This is actually code that you could just run essentially in your web app. And this opens up some interesting paths towards code sharing between your web app and your native app. But so you can use the same APIs, but you're doing so in a completely native iOS and Android context. This is going to use there's objectives, or this is going to use the actual iOS and Android APIs under the hood. The final thing I want to point out, and then I'll add a little bit more to this example, is because of the data binding approach, after I get data back, in this case I'm calling Reddit for some data here. When I get it back, all I have to do is push that data into this array, and it just pops up on the screen here. There's no need to tell the UI to update or anything like that, which I think is actually pretty cool. It keeps the code pretty small. You can see there's only like 30 lines of JavaScript code here to make this possible. So that is out of the way. This is, again, still not all that impressive. I'm showing something like 8 things on a screen right now. So I want to build on top of that. And to do that, I'm going to introduce the final of these NativeScript files, and that is CSS. So let's paste in a little bit of code here, because what I want to do is these things feel very cramped. There's really no spacing around these items here. So let me go back down to one column here. I'm going to paste in a little bit of CSS to configure the look of this. What I'm doing is I'm defining a class name here, Reddit item. So I'm going to go back to my XML here, and on this label, I'm going to say this has a class of Reddit item. And you'll see that I instantly get a little bit more spacing there in my list view. Now, what's cool about NativeScript's CSS implementation is that, again, these are things that we under the hood are breaking down, essentially implementing with iOS and Android code. So even though you get to type margin 10 here is something that feels very familiar if you've worked with CSS before, under the hoods, we're applying the appropriate Android or iOS sort of properties or syntax to actually give spacing in those layout systems. And because of LiveSync is running too, it's actually far easier to play with these things than if you were working in a native app. So you could play with the margins. If I wanted the color to be red, for instance, I could do that. Black, any number of things that I can play with, and it's really fast, it's really simple. But one thing I will note is that because we actually have to derive each of these properties you see here with native code, it doesn't mean that this is a fully complete CSS implementation. You can't just take a style sheet that you have for your web app and drop it into a NativeScript app and expect everything to work. There are some limitations. A lot of the limitations are either just things that are not really possible to do in an Android or iOS context, or there are some properties that just basically impose some significant performance penalties if we wanted to replicate them in a native app. You got to remember that this isn't a browser, this isn't a web app, so it doesn't always make sense to take properties that you use on the web in CSS and apply them to those contexts. Oftentimes there's some performance penalties and other such things that it just doesn't work. But the really common things that where CSS really comes in handy, things like configuring colors, configuring borders, margin, padding, height, width, those sort of things all work as you'd expect. And it's really powerful to be able to configure those things in CSS rather than having to do them in native code. Remember, the equivalent here is going into the Xcode, I think it's called the properties panel. I'm probably getting my names wrong. And manually configuring these things or figuring out the Objective-C code that you'd have to write to do those. So it's really convenient to be able to do this in CSS code instead. So I have that. App's getting a little bit better. We're still pretty simple here. They're 30-some minutes in here. But I wanted to, my next thing I want to extend with this is do something that's kind of actually tricky to do in a web app and turn this into an endless scroll list. Now, if you've ever tried to do this in a web app, as I have, you know that you instantly run into weird problems with the DOM and memory, like having to recycle DOM nodes and virtually scroll and do all these weird hacky things. But on Android and iOS, these sort of endless scroll things are built into the OS. The iOS and Android each have controls to handle this and make this quite easy, meaning it's also quite easy to do this in a NativeScript app as well. Now, I mentioned earlier I'm using Reddit's API, and one of the reasons I'm doing that is, first of all, if you do tech demos at all, Reddit's API is actually spectacular because they don't really care what you do with it. There's no like authentication. You just call some JSON API, and they really don't care. But also that they also make it really convenient to sort of build this endless scroll list because they have this after query string built in directly to the API. And if you just pass this increasingly large values, then you can continue to get new data from this thread here. So to do that, I am actually going to track. They pass back essentially where the endpoint, or basically where you're leaving off in the data. And I'm just going to make a slight change to my code here, essentially to track that, which I'm going to do here. And then the one other thing I have to do is I have to go into my XML here, and NativeScript has a hook for this. That basically says when you reach, so basically when the user scrolls to the bottom, their NativeScript will fire this event, load more items, which is just a hook for you to just do something. You can see I already got some data down here. And in this case, all I want to do, because I'm now tracking this after variable, is when NativeScript gives me this hook to do something, I'm just going to call this list to continuously get new data from Reddit. And if I open this up now, you can see that now with just that tiny bit of code, I can scroll through this list and really without any changes, the performance of this list, and you can see this in an emulator, but you could try this on a device too, that the performance actually feels quite nice. This is a native app. This is not a web app. So you get those sort of things just out of the box. I don't need any sort of special configuration to add this functionality to this app. It all just kind of works just because we're building on top of native components. I want to make this a little more interesting. Hopefully this hasn't been too boring so far, but this thread here, this awe thread, the reason I use this is it's what Reddit calls its cuteness thread, which means two things for me. First of all, it's kind of some demo-friendly images, so hopefully we get some cute cats and dogs and stuff. The other thing is that it's about 200% more likely to be work appropriate than other things on Reddit, so hopefully we get back some safe for work stuff. We'll have to cross our fingers on that. So I'm going to, cat there, I'm going to make this template. Remember, this template is how each individual item in this list actually gets laid out. And what I'm going to do is before I just had a label, I'm adding an image to it as well. And I'll explain what this is doing here in a second. The other thing I want to do is give this image an actual dimension, just because you get all sorts of different shapes and sizes and weird things back from Reddit. And now with this in place, you can see with just, again, a few more lines of code, I now have an endless scroll list that's not only endless scroll here, but I also have some amazing images in my list as well. I think I'll just leave that one up there for a second. Now, I showed this code earlier. I think the only thing I didn't explain was this stack layout here. Now, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about CSS how some CSS properties work within a NativeScript app, but not all of them do. And the ones that tend to not work are the things related to layout. So think things like float, or there's no concept of like display block or display inline in NativeScript because there's no concept of that on iOS and Android. So generally speaking, whenever you have more than one UI component that appears in some block within your application, you have to tell NativeScript how to actually lay these things out. And at NativeScript, we provide, I think it's now 5 different ways that you can do this, 5 different layout implementations. The simplest of these, as the one I'm using here, is just a stack layout, which just as its name sort of implies, just says to stack things up on top of each other. You can also, this thing has an orientation property, so by default, it'll stack things on top of each other. You could say orientation equals horizontal if you wanted them to appear side by side as well. The other common one is there's a grid layout as well that basically lets you divide a screen or a quadrant of the screen up into rows and columns. And that tends to be the thing that I use more often for more complex layouts than what we're seeing here. So I've been on Android for a minute here. I want to take, let's see, we're at about 42 past the hour. So I want to show a couple more things here before we get into Q&A. I've been showing everything on Android so far. I'm going to switch back over to iOS because I want to show off one additional concept here. So let me see. I think yeah, there we go. Let me start this thing back up in iOS. What I want to show is first of all, what this looks like on iOS, because remember, this is cross-platform code. I haven't been writing anything. You don't see any Android or iOS checks in here. These are all things that just work cross-platform. So when this loads up on iOS, you can see that even though I've been working in Android, I get sort of the equivalent iOS experience here out of the box. So I see the same sort of control built in. But we're using completely native controls under the hood. So you get some of this just natively implemented behavior for free, and I don't know what's going on there. But for like on iOS, for instance, you can tap the status bar on the top of the screen to go to the top of a UI table view. And that's just sort of thing is just happens to be built in. But the reason I switched over to iOS here is I want to show one additional feature off. And that's something that Dan sort of got in earlier, is that even though in NativeScript we give you these abstractive views of iOS and Android so that you don't necessarily need to know the iOS or Android specific things, one of the other things we're really proud of is that we also give you direct access to the nitty gritty, basically all of Android and iOS, because it's sort of our belief that we want to make the easy things easy so that you can do these things without having to know that, but make the sort of hard things or the times where you really need to customize your app. Like you really want this to look like an iOS app, or your boss sees something on his iPhone and he wants you to replicate it in your app. We don't think that we should be holding you back on that. You should always have the power to do anything you can do natively. And so I want to give you one example of that. And to do that, I'm going to paste in another UI component here, the action bar, which actually, let me get LiveSync running, LiveSync iOS, get a watcher running so we can see those changes pushed out. So I'm going to add an action bar to the top of my iOS app. And I'm going to add a little bit of CSS code to actually change what that thing looks like. See the action bar appear there. I want this thing to have sort of a bluish color scheme, just to show what that looks like, and some white text. And we'll see if LiveSync gets stuck on me, if the demo gods are with me today or not. So I'm changing that. Looks like NativeScript, we just had a release, so the demo gods are not looking upon me today. What you'll see in a second here is this bar is actually going to change blue. LiveSync is failing for me, so I'm just running through an iOS build, which will push that change out. As you'll see the top of the screen here change blue in just a second. There we go. Now I'm doing this because I wanted to show, for instance, you'll notice this iOS status bar, even though I'm controlling through my CSS here, the action bar, I'm changing this to a dark blue color, and changing the color to white. in NativeScript right now, there's no UI components that let you change the status bar. This is just something that's built into iOS. However, because NativeScript gives you full access to these controls, there's no reason you can't just use the appropriate iOS APIs to actually change this thing. So what I'm going to do is go back into my JavaScript code here. I have a little placeholder here that I'm going to paste some code into. And you can see this is the first time I've actually introduced some sort of conditional logic in my app. So everything I've done this far has just been really exactly the same code-wise for iOS and Android. But in NativeScript, we always sort of let you step in to do these sort of platform-specific things. There's a couple other ways besides just simple if checks that you can do this, but just a simple if check to see if you're running on iOS tends to be the simplest way. And what I'm going to do in this case is say, okay, let me actually get a reference to the UI navigation bar, which is an iOS API. And I'm going to change its bar style. Again, this is iOS code. This is not a property that NativeScript defines. This is actually something that iOS defines. So you could go to the UI navigation bar iOS docs and find this. And I'm setting to UI bar style black. I love the verbose iOS APIs. But what this does is it'll actually change the look of the status bar. So I'm going to try my luck with LiveSync again. Let's see, LiveSync iOS -- emulator, and we'll see if that actually pushes that out. And what you should see is that now when this app loads, I'm going to go into this bit of code on iOS. It'll actually just change the look of that status bar on the top of the screen, and you can see it there. It'll show it with white text. The idea here is that really with NativeScript overall, we are trying to make it easy for you to build native apps. If you just know a bit of JavaScript and learn how our UI components work, you can see that there's not really much code needed to build these things. But then at the same time that you can get at the native platform when you really need to do that customization. Let's see, I've got about 10 minutes left here. So I want to make sure I get to one final feature here. So I'm going to toss in a bit more code. What I want to do is basically I've got this sort of big long list here. I have it for iOS. I have it for Android over here. And I want to turn this into another common, love the cat, another common UI thing that people have to do and turn this into a master detail view so that I can actually individually click on these items and take me to a detailed view of this. This is another thing that works exactly like this load more items attribute that we saw earlier. With NativeScript, we have this item, if I can type, item tap attribute that essentially NativeScript will trigger that event whenever the user clicks on one of these things, actually in the list. And then again, this is tying this to JavaScript code, so I just have to go in here and define what this should actually do when I tap on it. So I'm going to, in this case, say instead navigate the user to this other page, which I've defined here. And I'm going to go back here and set up LiveSync again for Android. Watch this, and we'll see if this works appropriately. What should happen is when I tap on an individual item, as I do here, NativeScript will fire that item tap attribute, which will take me to a new page. The new page is completely blank, so nothing in particular is happening at the moment. But you can see that, again, this is a native app, so things like the Android back hardware button just works out of the box when you do the navigation because this is a native app. So let's see, I want to make sure that you can actually see this. So I'm going to go into the detailed view here. We're running low on time, so I'm just going to try to get a few things in here for this actual detail. I won't go into much detail of what this is doing right here other than this is basically the same things we've seen before with XML. I just have a page here with an action bar and an actual image that displays. So I can go here and you can see now the image of the cat shows when I go back and forth. I can look at actual details of these images on the screen, see what they look like. So I have that. The last thing I want to show is actually how you can tie into some more native functionality. So my very last demo here is I'm going to toss another UI component here on the screen. I actually need to add that within the action bar. So I'm going to toss that here. Nope, I got the wrong one. So I need NX14 to toss a little button on the action bar. It'll appear up here in the top of the screen. And then what I want to do here is I want to give users on the detail screen here a way to share these images. So I'm basically building the ability for people to look at cute images from Reddit and then sort of share them with their friends. So for that, what we have with NativeScript is we have a large collection of plugins that you can actually use that tie into native functionality. So we looked earlier at how we had things like this UI bar style and how you can do this. But one of the things we realize is that your average web developer isn't going to know how APIs like this work. So one of the things we do is we make plugins available for you to tie into this sort of native functionality. And one plugin I've already installed, you install plugins through npm install, is this NativeScript social share plugin, which you see here, which just gives you a convenient API to tie into the native sharing icon that appears on your device. So what I'm going to do to use it, since I already have this thing installed, I'm going to go into my code here, bring this in, again using the require function to bring in another JavaScript module, and then down here define what this share image is going to do, and it's just going to call this share image function. And then finally, go down into, I have to give this thing an actual image, and then this should be the last thing I get to see. So I get to click on this now, click the share button, and through the magic of live coding, this didn't work. But what I should be able to do is actually show a sharing sheet. And to give you an idea of how this works, I can go over to our NativeScript plugin marketplace, where you can see all the plugins that we provide available. The social share one is listed here. And what you should have seen, if the demo gods were with me today, is a screen that looks a little something like this. So with that, that's really what I wanted to show you today. If you're interested in NativeScript, I'll point you out at a few other things that you can use to get started. If you go to nativescript.org, you'll see this big green Getting Started button. That'll take you to a guide that takes about an hour to go through that gives you an idea of how you can get started with your NativeScript app. If you want to see some samples that are a little more complex than this, you can go to the Samples tab here, where we have a slew of different apps that are available that you can use as part of your app. All of these have their source code available on GitHub, and many of them are also in the iOS App Store and Google Play. If you want to just quickly see on your device what NativeScript is capable of, you could download this app. It's actually Examples NativeScript. So let me type it out here. Search for this on either Google Play or the iOS App Store. And this is a sample app that we provide that just gives you an idea of what NativeScript is capable of. And you can also view our, if I go into here, the different showcases that we have available as well under developers. Actually, it's Dan's going to have to help me out with where our showcase, about showcases. Dan just actually updated this. So with that, that's all I have. I think I'm going to turn it back over so that we have some time here for Q&A as well. So let me, Dan, are you back on the line?
I am.
Excellent. So do we have any questions that came in? Through the list right here.
And you guys will notice I switched the view to a display to focus on the chat, and also to offer a place for people to make comments and review ratings. If you guys need to show something, just let me know. We can switch it back to a view where you can show something.
Okay. Well, Chris wants to know about Flexbox. So I think this was answered earlier, but Flexbox is sort of a way to make HTML behave to the needs of an application. And on the native platform, you don't really need that. So unlike HTML, which really is a document markup language that's been forced to do things it's not really intended to do, when you say, give me a 3-column grid in NativeScript, you get a 3-column grid on all the native platforms. No need for Flexbox.
We do have some requests. If you go to github.com/nativescript/nativescript and you look in the issues, you'll see it is possible for us to sort of create Flexbox with one of the XML components that you saw, sort of like stack layout. We could essentially implement a flex layout as well. So if you're interested in seeing that and you think you have a good use case for why you think that would be valuable, just hunt out that issue and let us know.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Just like like you'd imagine, the NativeScript team is very, very responsive to feedback and requests. And like if you blog, we know about it. So I think you'll find one of the things that excited me most, and you'll also find this, is the NativeScript community is a very happy, good energy, fun community to be a part of. And it's exciting every day to see what's happening.
Yeah, so there's also a question about info.plist and how they're handled for iOS. So one of the things I didn't get into a whole lot is there's within the app folder, there's also this folder we call app resources. And basically what that is a place that you can put your native-y things. So that includes things like info plist, like your Android manifest, your splash screens, your app icons, things like that. And within app resources, you could put those files, and then the NativeScript CLI, when your project gets built, sort of takes those native files into account and injects them or builds with them as part of building the application. So if you put an info plist at, let's see, it would be app resources, iOS info plist, the NativeScript CLI will use that as part of building your app instead of the sort of default natively generated one. I'm just looking, CSS limitations. Is there a full docs listing these differences and limitations? So yes, if you go to the docs on the sidebar, you'll see an article just called styling. If you just search for styling on the docs, there's a list of supported CSS selectors and supported CSS properties. So basically, it's a whitelist approach in NativeScript. There's just a straight list of things that are supported. So if you go down there, you could just see the giant list of what's there and what's available to use.
There was a question about regional or other NativeScript conferences. We do have conference time at NGCom, for example, and there's a bunch of other events that we're doing. We're also interested in possibly doing some more online stuff if you guys are interested. On the nativescript.org site is a way where you can give us your email to sign up for our very fancy newsletter. That's the best way to stay in touch with things like that. You can always watch Twitter, but Twitter, so much stuff flies past Twitter, I don't even know what's happening. So if you want to stay plugged in, give us your email. We'll only use it for newsletters, and we'll make sure the newsletter is worth your time.
All right, I think I'm not seeing any other questions. If you have any other ones, drop them in. But I think that's all we had.
What areas can NativeScript improve? Well, what I always say is there is no finished software. There's abandoned software. We're not abandoning NativeScript, so I think there's a lot of things that could be improved for sure. One of the things we're asked about constantly is getting support for Windows Ultimate, and that would be a way where you can deploy your app to a Windows Phone or even Windows 10 operating system. There's, I believe, an upcoming way to build Mac apps, but I don't know too much about that. There's all sorts of features we want to add.
Yeah, the big thing that comes
we're not done.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind is plugins with NativeScript. That's something that we think that really sort of enables NativeScript developers. And you saw, like when I showed at Telerik, we sort of maintain this plugins marketplace, but at the moment we've got about 10 plugins in there, and I think we've got another batch of like 5 or 6 coming. And we've got, like, if you look on npm and do a search for NativeScript, you can see there's something like over 100 plugins on there. But what we want to do is we want to do a better job of surfacing the sort of plugins that are well written, that work really well across devices, ones that developers can sort of feel confident working. So I think our effort is both surfacing the good plugins and then also sort of enabling the community to create more of these things. I mean, we'd love to see NativeScript plugins for just about anything out there that you'd want to do in a native app. Any movement to get NativeScript support in WebStorm? Dan, I think you know something about that.
Yeah, we're actually in communication with them. They have some support now. So if you like TypeScript and you put the definitions in the right place, the experience isn't bad. There's some further things we could do with integrating with a debugger. They don't have a debugger. We aren't sure we want to write one for them. I would say that there's this editor called VS Code. Have you guys ever heard of Visual Studio Code? I know, right? Visual Studio, run! No, it's actually pretty great. It's a free editor from Microsoft that is fantastic for web languages, and we have support in VS Code for NativeScript with step debugging and inspection and all the things you really want. And like I say, it's free, so I would totally consider that. I'm a IntelliJ user. I have IntelliJ Ultimate, so I kind of wish there was better support already for it. But frankly, you got to go with what you got, and VS Code is a pretty good solution for this. Should we do something with IntelliJ, I'll let you know. But like I say, if you want to use TypeScript and you use the TypeScript definitions, you can get a fair long way with it.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning too that I mean you can use any IDE with NativeScript. Like I was using Sublime Text today when I was demoing NativeScript, and I mean there's nothing necessarily built into Sublime Text to sort of integrate with NativeScript, and I still find it just fine, especially when you use live sync and you have like a watcher like approach, then everything going on in the terminal is sort of behind the scenes anyways, that you don't necessarily even really have to worry about it. So for the most part, I find, at least when I'm developing in NativeScript, for the most time I'm just editing JavaScript, XML, and CSS files. And for that, it doesn't matter a whole ton, at least to me, what editor I'm working in. All right. Uh,
Dave, when you say release with certs, what do you mean by that?
oh, so yeah, so compiling for debug tests, what about certs? So what we have with NativeScript, like if you wanted to do a release, say for the App Store or Google Play, I was using the TNS run command. There's also a TNS build command that just gives you sort of an executable, and flag has, or that command, I should say, has a dash dash release flag that sort of turns on the building with sort of your production certs. For Android, you have to pass it like the key store information that Android needs. For iOS, you have to configure the appropriate provisioning profiles as well. We have docs for this. If you're on docs.nativescript.org, there's an article on the side that's titled "Publishing NativeScript Apps in the App Store and Google Play," and that'll really walk you through the details of how to do that. Will NativeScript work with code push is a question. It's something that we're talking with Microsoft about. It's certainly possible because code push right now, if you're not familiar with what it is, it's basically a little library that Microsoft wrote to let you sort of live update production apps. And right now they support Cordova and React Native. And there's no technical reason that library can't support NativeScript as well. So we've been talking with them about getting NativeScript implemented in there as well. Does it play nicely with Fastlane? I do not know what Fastlane is. I don't know if you do, Dan. Dan, did we lose you from the line? Yeah, I'm not sure what.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to Joe's.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what Fastlane is. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, it looks like Fastlane looks like CI for iOS and Android. Is that about right, Chris? Haven't seen this before.
Yeah, so one nice thing is that, so really with, because these are native apps, generally speaking, you should be able to use any of these sort of existing things that are out there for iOS and Android apps. And I mean, that includes things like profiling tools and functional testing tools and analytics tools and that sort of thing. And those things should just work. I can't say that as a blanket statement, but since they are actual native apps, there's no reason why it really shouldn't work. one thing I didn't mention is that we also have a little unit testing mechanism that's built into the NativeScript CLI. I think it's TNS test, Android or iOS. And we have examples. If you look at the groceries samples, and if you just go to github.com/nativescript and search for groceries, we recently hooked Travis CI into that app, and we now have it running groceries test suite on every commit, and that's set up as well. So we have some mechanisms built in to handle those sorts of things. And because it's just a generic CLI, I don't really think you'll run into problems, but I can't say that for absolutely sure. And yeah, so there's a couple questions too about like interface builders, or one thing we didn't talk about as well is that with Telerik, we have what's known as the Telerik platform, which is our paid mobile offering. And that has support for NativeScript that adds in some premium features. And one thing App Builder does is it just gives you an IDE that you can use for NativeScript development. And we have some convenient functions for sort of deploying to devices, deploying to little testing apps. We also have things like analytics. We'll help you send push notifications in NativeScript and things like that as well. Yeah, good question about crash reporting with JavaScript stack traces. Yeah, I don't know in terms of like, so I mean, when you're doing NativeScript development, the stack traces will just appear in your console and they're pretty easy to read. But I don't actually have any good advice for like if you wanted to have some tool that would report you of different stack traces that happened within your native apps, that'd be a good thing for us to follow up on because I'm not sure. All right. Are we missing anything else, Stan?
Looks like we got them all. If you guys have a question and it wasn't answered, let us know.
Yeah, and I'll paste into the chat to my Twitter handle, which is probably the best place to reach out to me if you have any questions. And Dan just pasted in his as well. And we also watch the @NativeScript Twitter handle pretty closely as well. So if you have any questions, you can ping that as well, and quite a few people see it there. HTML.
Blink tag support, that's hilarious. Now let me actually say that unlike hybrid solutions, with NativeScript you get native animation. So if you want to implement that, go nuts.
Yeah, you could build it.
We actually have on our blog a couple of really cool examples of what people have been doing lately with animations. It's some pretty slick stuff.
Yeah, you can animate opacity, and so you could totally tie in a NativeScript label UI component, make it a blink component with some animations. Definitely possible. So looking forward to seeing that in your production apps.
Oh yeah, speaking of which, in the presentation download, like I said, you can download this presentation. The last slide is actually a GIF animation of building a small app with some animations. So if you're the kind of person that's going, man, I'd love to do this at my user group, but I don't want to have to live code, boy, do we have a solution for you. It's slide 24. All you have to do is just put it up there and let it play, and you'll look like a hero.
Yeah, one more question about...
Sweet. Yeah. I think that's kind of... Oh, go ahead, TJ.
Okay, we'll make this the last question, then we'll cut it off. The final question I see in there is how mature is App Builder? And so App Builder has been around for almost 3 years now, so it's a pretty mature product at this point. However, NativeScript within App Builder is fairly recent, probably about a year or so. So with App Builder, our support, we also support building Cordova apps in that tool as well. And that's very robust, has been around for a while. The NativeScript support is somewhat newer, so I suppose you could judge for yourself, but it's been around a year, and I find it relatively stable for building with NativeScript. All right, and I guess that's it. So thanks everybody for showing up. This was fun.
Yep, thanks. Take it away, Charlie.
Yeah, thanks to you guys for coming on, and I'll be stopping the recording in just a moment because there may be somebody waiting to ask a question and they don't want it on the recording. So I'll stop the recording. As I said in one of the links earlier, comments earlier, the session is recorded. They're all available at recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com, recordings plural.coldfusionmeetup.com. and there you'll be able to link to the recording. It'll be available as soon as we stop it, and then later I'll get it posted on Vimeo and YouTube, and there's a channel for the meetup on those. So with that, thanks to everybody for your kind remarks. Thanks especially to Dan and TJ for the talk today, and we do look forward to having more sessions on the meetup in the near future. Got people lined up and some topics that I'll do if we don't get any speakers. And if any of you listening are interested in presenting, we'll take any topic anywhere related to ColdFusion. As you can see, this one was really tangentially related, but ColdFusion topics or something related to it are welcome. All right, and with that, I'll thank you guys again. Stop the recording and stick around for any questions that may come up afterwards.